Clearly, it is apparent that the government is following an agenda. The proposals in the budget are completely aligned to the government priorities. So whether it is a matter of startups or giving flip to the manufacturing or looking at the moderate tax rate, widening the tax base, all that is very clearly reflected in the budget in the provisions. If you look at the manufacturing, the large number of the manufacturing that happens in the MSME sector, the budget clearly proposes to reduce the tax rate for them from current 30% to 25%. And as the finance minister noted in his speech, that this covers over 80% in number those enterprises which are in that business. Similarly, in relation to the startup, we all knew that the startup fund change the shareholding when they increase their funding going forward. And in that case, the initial year's losses get lost. And this was very clearly becoming a hurdle for startups to get the funding, but then lose the loss benefit to carry forward. And it is now provided that no, they would not lose the benefit subject to the original promoter retaining their holding as it was before. Other aspect was increasing the tax base and reducing the tax rates. So for increasing the tax base, there are numerous measures other than the administrative side which are prescribed in the budget as proposals. So if you look at the budget proposals on increasing the tax base, clearly one thing was mentioned, that demonetization data of tons of terabytes would suddenly be analyzed and be used by tax department and administration to identify where are the taxpayers missing from the tax net. And one aspect here which was emphasized was that the tax department seeks to use technology and the analytics to do the finding and identification of the taxpayers rather than having a personal interaction with the citizen at large, which is an inefficient way of identifying the taxpayers. And he did mention in his speech that we are wanting to curtail and reduce the personal interaction of the regulators and the taxpayers to the extent possible. The second thing in relation to widening the tax base we clearly saw was the recommendation made by SIT that not more than 3 lakhs transaction in cash should be accepted has been proposed, that if there is a transaction of greater than 10 lakhs per day under certain circumstances, that would result into a heavy fine of an amount equal to the amount of the dealing which is greater than 3 lakhs. It's a very large sum in terms of keeping a deterrent on the transactions. Similarly, in the individuals and HUFs, those were not required to do the withholding taxes for the domestic payments, and it is found that rental is one area where there could be a leakage, and it is prescribed that now the individuals and HUF would also deduct 5% tax from any payment of rentals if it exceeds 50,000 rupees per month. This is another way of finding out the new taxpayers or non-filers who are not in the tax net. And if you slowly look at all, this is resulting into getting wider tax base by increasing the number of taxpayers. On the other hand, there are proposals to sustain or retain the tax base with reference to the quantum of income. So there are proposals which clearly prescribe that in relation to an asymmetrical transaction, you would see the two sides of the transaction and not give a deduction or the cost step up unless the income tax has been paid on one side of the transaction. This has been done in relation to the transactions of merger and demerger. This has also been done in relation to the transactions in transfer pricing, where it is prescribed as secondary adjustment, which means that if there was a company which was to get an X amount into India and it did not get an X amount but made the adjustment voluntarily into its tax return, So in that case, effectively what happened, it created an asymmetry to reduce the tax base in India, because if you were expected to get a 17% revenue, and that instead of 17% you got a 10% revenue, that to the extent of 7% the tax base which could have been created in India got lost. And here the secondary adjustment is specifically now prescribed in regulations to say that the taxpayer himself would make the secondary adjustment in such cases. Similarly, in relation to the interest payment to the associated enterprises, the thin capitalization regulations provide that 30% of EBITDA is the max cap for interest deductibility for associated enterprises, and if interest payment is in excess of that, it can be carried forward, but for a year it would become a disallowable expenditure. So on an overall basis, if you look at it, there are very clear-cut agenda to move forward to increase both the number of taxpayers and also increase the base on which the tax is levied, and hopefully this will result in collection of taxes in an optimized manner and therefore reduce the tax rates in future. So I think on an overall basis, the budget serves the tax needs from a very concerted agenda, and it should on a long term increase the tax GDP ratio and enhance the effectiveness of the tax administration. And he did also mention about the accountability of the tax administration, and that it's more an administrative issue, but I'm sure that's also very important aspect to get a trust and confidence of the taxpayer into the system, which further increases the compliances. The other aspect of this is when the tax system is gearing up to use the technology, to use the data analytics to identify the taxpayers, you can expect that there are more and more reporting requirements coming in. And in relation to such reporting requirements, the tax functions of the organizations are going to feel burdened, and therefore I'm sure there would be a need for the tax organizations to see how they can also correspondingly use technology to meet the new standard and new norm of the higher reporting as is required by the changes not only in domestic law, also internationally. So I look forward for a better tax administration, more effective tax collection, and a higher tax GDP ratio and moderate rates of tax resulting out of this budget.